Look who they tried to warn each other about. Look who they built emergency protocols around. Look who made their most trusted circle sit down in a room, lower their voices, and say, "Do not engage." And before we go any further, if you are someone who wants to go deeper into the psychology behind everything we discuss on this channel, we have put together a bundle of 4 books that will completely rewire how you see power, silence, and the people who fear both. You can grab all 4 together at a discounted price or pick up whichever one speaks to you individually. Every link is in the description below. Not because you were dangerous in the way small people mean dangerous. Not because you were broken or reckless or carrying some visible flaw they could point at and justify themselves with. But because somewhere deep in whatever was left of their instincts, they knew. They already knew what touching you would cost them, and they didn't listen. Let that sit for a moment. Let that land exactly where it needs to land. Because this isn't a story about your enemies winning. This is the story of what happens when fate stops being subtle, when consequence stops being patient, and when the universe stops whispering and starts slamming doors that cannot be reopened. You were the warning. You were the signal they chose to ignore. And now we are sitting in the full weight of the aftermath of their decision. And the view from here is something they will never, not for the rest of their lives, be able to unsee. Their own oracle, their own source of truth, their own inner compass. The person closest to the center of everything they were building told them clearly, told them firmly, told them with the kind of certainty that doesn't arrive often in a lifetime and doesn't repeat itself when ignored. Do not engage. And they looked at that warning, folded it neatly, placed it somewhere between their arrogance and their appetite, and they came for you anyway. So, let's talk about that. Let's talk about every single thing that came after that choice. There is a moment that exists in every dangerous situation, a moment before impact, before consequence, before the thing that cannot be undone becomes the only reality available. That moment has a sound. It sounds like instinct. It sounds like hesitation. It sounds like the quiet voice in the back of a room that says firmly, without decoration, "Something about this does not feel right." They had that moment. They stood fully inside that moment. They felt it in their chest, in their gut, in the part of them that hadn't yet been completely consumed by their own agenda, and they dismissed it. You have to understand what that dismissal means. When someone receives a warning and ignores it, they don't become innocent victims of whatever follows. They become the architects of their own collapse. Every single fracture that came for them afterward, every exposure, every reversal of fortune that left them gasping and confused and scrambling for an explanation that would hold up under scrutiny was not bad luck. It was not random cruelty from an indifferent universe. It was the invoice arriving precisely on time for the decision they made when they had every reason in the world to choose differently and refused. Their oracle wasn't a stranger. Their oracle wasn't someone operating from a place of ignorance about what was being planned, or from a misplaced loyalty to someone who didn't deserve protection. The warning came from inside the house. It came from the person who had watched them operate long enough to understand the pattern, to see the trajectory before it completed, to recognize that you specifically were a line that should not be crossed, not a suggestion, not a preference, a recognition of something that could not end well for anyone who proceeded past that point. Because this is what arrogance does to a person who has never been genuinely tested. Arrogance doesn't make you brave. Arrogance makes you blind. It takes everything you should be afraid of and dresses it in the costume of an easy target. It took you, someone carrying the kind of quiet that only comes from having survived things they wouldn't last a week inside of, and told them you were nothing to worry about. Arrogance is the most expensive lie a person can believe about themselves. And the billing arrives in ways that cannot be negotiated or disputed. So they went ahead, they made the call, they sent the message, or they started the campaign, or they whispered into the right ears, or they extended the hand that was never meant to offer anything genuine. And the moment they did, the clock started. Not your clock, theirs. The countdown to the moment when everything their oracle tried to spare them from became the only reality they knew how to live in. And that clock, once started, does not accommodate appeals for mercy. It simply runs. Here is what they never actually understood about you. They looked at your stillness and called it weakness. They looked at your silence and called it defeat. They looked at the way you moved through the world without broadcasting your power, without announcing your arrival, without needing the room to pause and confirm your presence. And they made the most catastrophic miscalculation a person can make about another human being. They thought you were soft because you were quiet. They thought you were small because you were still. They mistook the discipline of your composure for the absence of depth. But you were not still because you had nothing inside you. You were still because everything inside you was calibrated. You were still the way a storm is still before it fully organizes itself. You were still the way a cathedral is still. Full-loaded, ancient, carrying the weight of something built to outlast everything that tries to tear it down. Your silence was not absence. Your silence was accumulation. Every day of quiet, every month of composure, every year of choosing construction over reaction that was not passivity. That was a very specific kind of preparation, and they walked directly into it without a mat. You had already been through things that would have dismantled them completely, long before they arrived in your life, with their schemes and their strategies and their quietly devastating intentions. You had already walked through fires they have never even seen the smoke of. You had already sat with losses that would have redefined their entire understanding of pain. You had already rebuilt yourself more than once from raw material, without applause, without audience, without anyone standing at the finish line confirming you had made it. You rebuilt because rebuilding was necessary. That is a different kind of person. And that is the thing about people who have survived real things. They carry a kind of density that cannot be faked and cannot be broken by amateurs. They carry the kind of gravity that people who have only ever faced comfortable struggles cannot recognize until it is far too late for that recognition to be useful. They thought they were engaging with someone who had never been tested. They were engaging with someone who had been tested so many times that the testing itself had become a language they were fluent in. They brought a phrase. You were holding the entire dictionary. You knew what they were doing before they finished doing it. You recognized the pattern before the second move was played. You understood the end game while they were still celebrating what they believed was a successful opening. And you didn't react. You didn't expose yourself. You didn't give them the confirmation they needed to justify the next stage of what they were planning. You simply watched calmly, completely. The way someone watches a storm through the window of a house they know was built to withstand exactly this kind of weather, exactly this level of force. Their oracle was not being dramatic. Their oracle was not speaking from paranoia or from some sentimental attachment to a person who didn't deserve defending. When those three words were delivered, do not engage, they were delivered from a place of genuine, precise, experiential recognition. The kind of recognition that only comes from watching something operate at a level you understand, is beyond what you are equipped to handle comfortably. And the weight of those words was real. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a preference. It was a verdict. What do not engage meant was this: there are people in the world who are not your prey. There are people whose constitution is fundamentally different from what you are equipped to process. There are people whose wounds have made them wiser than your strategies, whose losses have made them more formidable than your plans, whose silence has made them more powerful than your noise could ever reach. This person, this quiet, particular, deeply constructed person, is one of them, and the cost of pretending otherwise is not a cost you are prepared to pay. What do not engage meant was whatever you think you are going to gain from this, subtract from it everything you are about to lose, and then subtract more. Because the cost of engaging with someone operating at that level of inner organization is not simply a setback. It is a reckoning. It is the kind of confrontation that doesn't just push you back. It restructures your understanding of what you are actually capable of at a fundamental level. That restructuring is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thing you recover from quickly or quietly or without consequence. What do not engage meant was, you are not ready. Your confidence may be genuine. Your preparation may feel thorough. But readiness is not determined by your confidence in yourself. Readiness is determined by your accurate understanding of what you are facing. And you do not have an accurate understanding of what you are facing. You are looking at this person through the lens of every target you have successfully handled before. And this person is not that. This person is categorically, fundamentally, architecturally not that. The comparison is not just wrong, it is the source of everything that is about to go wrong. They heard all of it. Perhaps not in these exact words. Perhaps it arrived through a look that held too long, through a silence that landed differently than silences usually do, through the way someone they trusted went very still when your name came up in conversation. The signal was there. The signal was clear. The signal was delivered by someone who cared enough about them to speak the difficult thing out loud. And they chose the brittle confidence of their own assumptions over the wisdom of someone trying to protect them. And what followed is the permanent record of that choice. The moment they engaged, the moment they made the decision to proceed despite every signal pointing in the opposite direction, something shifted in the architecture of their reality. Not loudly, not visibly, but somewhere in the structure of what was about to unfold, a sequence was initiated that was never going to end in their favor. A sequence that had been waiting with the patience of something that understands it does not need to rush for exactly this trigger. The trigger of a person who was warned, who understood the warning, and who chose their own certainty over wisdom. They came at you with the tools they had always used. The quiet campaign, the strategic positioning, the planted questions designed to shift the ground beneath your credibility without leaving fingerprints, the carefully placed information that was meant to make the people around you see you slightly differently. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be challenged directly, just enough to create the conditions for the next move. It was not a new playbook, it was the only playbook they had ever needed. It had worked before on people who didn't already know the play. But you were not those people. You had seen this exact choreography applied to others, and you had studied it from a place of clear, patient, analytical understanding. You knew that the campaign would begin with questions. You knew the questions were designed to plant doubt rather than seek truth. You knew that the doubt would be given just enough room to grow before the next element arrived. You knew all of it. And knowing it made you something their entire strategy was not equipped to handle, completely, devastatingly, unmovably unaffected. And unaffected is the only response a campaign of this nature cannot survive. Here is what unaffected does to a strategy designed to create effect. It collapses it, not dramatically, not with confrontation or a visible countermove, but quietly, internally, from the inside. The way a structure collapses when the foundation is compromised. First, there are small signals that something isn't working. The reactions they expected don't materialize. The cracks they were positioned to exploit don't appear. The vulnerability they counted on finding isn't there, wasn't there, was never there, and the whole structure of what they built against you begins to lean in the wrong direction. They kept pushing because pride does not permit retreat. To stop was to confirm that the warning had been right. To pull back was to acknowledge that they had engaged with something they were fundamentally not equipped to handle. And the specific brittle pride of a person who has never been genuinely tested does not survive that acknowledgement. So they escalated, and every escalation was another invoice. Every additional move was another entry in the ledger that was being maintained with the kind of quiet, meticulous accuracy that only truth is capable of. While they were building campaigns against you, you were building. Not a counter-campaign, not a defense infrastructure or a network of allies primed for eventual confrontation. You were building the exact thing their entire operation was designed to prevent yourself. Quietly, consistently, without broadcasting the progress, without requiring an audience for the construction. You were inside the laboratory of your own becoming, and the results of that work were not meant for their eyes. Not yet. Not until the work had reached the point where it spoke for itself without requiring any assistance from you. You stopped responding to things designed to provoke a response. Not because you didn't see them, not because you didn't feel them land. The absence of reaction is never the absence of awareness. You felt every single thing they directed at you. You cataloged it. You understood it with a clarity that would have disturbed them if they had known the extent of it. And then you made the decision that separates the people who win long-term from the people who win a moment. You refused to let their agenda set your schedule. You refused to let their agenda set your schedule. You refused to let their timeline become your timeline. You refused to let their urgency drag you out of yours. Because here's what they needed from you more than anything else they could have possibly taken. They needed you reactive. They needed you in defense mode, burning your energy and your bandwidth, justifying yourself to an audience that had been primed to doubt you before you opened your mouth. They needed you explaining, clarifying, managing a narrative that was never going to be manageable on their terms. Every moment you spent in that position was a moment you were not building, and your refusal to step into that trap was the single most destructive thing you could have done to everything they were attempting to construct. You healed in silence. And this is not a small thing. This is not a small thing. This is not a thing to be glossed over or minimized. Healing in silence while someone is actively and deliberately campaigning against you requires a level of discipline that cannot be fully understood by anyone who has never had to do it. It requires sitting with the discomfort of being misrepresented and choosing growth over reputation management. It requires watching your name be handled by people who do not deserve to speak it, and choosing your long-term foundation over short-term satisfaction. It requires trusting that truth does not require your constant defense to remain true. You understood something that they have not learned and may never learn. That your power was never in your reaction. Your power was in your composition. Your power was in the architecture of how you moved, how you held yourself, how you refused to be reduced to the version of you that their narrative required for its survival. Your power was in the thing they were attempting to collapse. And every time they pushed and found nothing gave way, your power grew. Not because you were performing strength, but because you were actually, genuinely, irreversibly stronger than anything they were capable of deploying against you. There is a moment in every conflict of this nature where the momentum reverses. It does not reverse with announcement. It doesn't come with a declaration or a visible public shift, or a moment that every person in the room recognizes simultaneously. It comes quietly. It comes as a feeling in the chest of the people who built the campaign. A feeling that something is not working the way it was supposed to work. A feeling that the target is not behaving like a target. A feeling that the architecture of what they constructed is echoing back differently than it should. That feeling is the turn. That feeling is the moment when the campaign stops being about you and starts being about them. Because campaigns built on something other than truth have a fundamental structural flaw that no amount of maintenance can permanently correct. They require constant effort to sustain a version of reality that is not real. And sustaining something false is exhausting in a way that sustaining something true never is. They were tired before you showed any visible sign of victory. Before anything external shifted, before anyone else noticed. They were already exhausted from the labor of keeping the fiction standing. And when people are exhausted from maintaining a lie, they make mistakes. Small ones first. A story that doesn't quite align with a previous version under the pressure of a direct question. A timeline that shifts slightly when two people who heard different things compare notes. A reaction that is too large for the provocation or too small in a way that someone paying careful attention would register. You were paying careful attention. You had been paying careful attention. You had been paying careful attention since before they began. And you started seeing the seams in what they had built, not because you were hunting for them, but because you could not help seeing them. The people around them began to see it too. Not all at once, not with any coordination. But the questions started arriving from unexpected directions. The ones that don't come from enemies. They come from allies who are beginning to wonder. The ones that begin with, "I'm sure it's nothing," and end with a concern that opens a door that was never meant to be examined. Their network, which had been carefully cultivated as an instrument against you, began to develop its own internal skepticism. And skepticism in a network built on manufactured consensus is not manageable. It is structural. It spreads. You didn't plant those doubts. You didn't engineer that unraveling from a position of tactical advantage. You simply continued to be exactly what you had always been. Consistent, composed, real. While they continued to perform something, they were growing visibly less able to sustain. The contrast was not something you manufactured. It was the inevitable consequence of truth existing in the same space as its carefully constructed replacement. Truth doesn't fight. Truth doesn't campaign or lobby or appeal. Truth simply remains. And everything built to replace it eventually collapses under the weight of its own insufficiency. When the exposure came, and it always comes for people who ignored the warning and proceeded anyway, without exception, without negotiation, without the mercy of indefinite delay, it did not arrive the way they had imagined it would. In their darker private moments, they had pictured a loud confrontation, a public reckoning, the kind of dramatic moment that they had been quietly preparing a response to since the early stages of the campaign. They had rehearsed. They had their narrative ready. They were in the specific way that people who know they are wrong always are prepared for the wrong version of the reckoning. But truth does not arrive loud when the person it is vindicating has been living quietly. Truth arrives in the precise shape of the silence it was kept in. It arrived in the way people started connecting things they had never thought to connect before. It arrived in the way certain past conversations began to be remembered differently once new information existed to reframe them. It arrived in the way the energy of rooms shifted when their name came up. A subtle but unmistakable shift from confidence to careful, from certainty to something slower, from comfortable dismissal to uneasy recalibration. And you are not even present for most of it. That is the detail they will take the longest to process. The reversal that defined their exposure was not something you orchestrated or engineered or positioned yourself to benefit from. It was the natural consequence of a structure built on sand finally encountering the tide. You are not the tide. You are the shore, immovable, present, exactly where you had always been. While everything they stacked against you was carried back out by a force that required no direction from you. The people who had been primed to see you as the problem began asking different questions. The people who had accepted the narrative without scrutiny began applying scrutiny for the first time. And when you apply scrutiny to something that was built specifically to avoid scrutiny, it does not hold gracefully. It fractures in ways that are impossible to explain away. It produces contradictions that cannot be reconciled without producing further contradictions. It creates the specific damning silence that follows when someone being asked to explain something realizes that any explanation they offer will make things considerably worse. That silence, that pause, that particular moment when someone who has been answering every question confidently suddenly has no answer that will hold up. That is the moment, that is the turn made visible. That is the point at which everyone in the room, without coordination, without a signal, without anyone having to say it aloud, arrives at the same understanding simultaneously. And every person that moment looked back at the beginning, remembered the warning, remembered who gave it, remembered exactly what was said, and understood with a clarity that arrived far too late to be of any use, that the oracle had been precisely, completely right.